In the last videos, we were talking about threads and whether they were male or female threads. If you remember from the 2 videos ago, we talked about what is a female thread and the idea you can make a thread in here if you drill a smaller hole than you need by a certain size. You look it up on the chart, and then you use a tap and you cut and you just open the hole up a little bit, and then you get a female thread. And if you've done it right, you can just get a regular bolt or screw going in there. We also talked about making a male thread. If you remember, if you have a certain round shaft or something, you need some thread on it. You start with the size that you want. The shaft has to be that size. Sorry, it'll be something like that, just a smooth round shaft. And then you get a die, which is the opposite of a tap, and you would cut a thread on the shaft that size. In this video, I want to expand even more to something that's a little bit of a gray area in many ways. And this idea of what's a nut, what's a bolt, what's a screw, what's a washer, what are all these things? Kind of all screwed up. And I put a bunch of stuff together here to quickly go through them. And just to help, I tried to make a little map of where I'm going, and I'm going to post that on the classroom as well. So I made up a bunch of sort of general questions, and the idea is to get you some hands-on, real-life understanding of this kind of stuff. Assuming some of you or many of you in your life will go on into something technical or cross paths with these kinds of concepts. And hopefully it kind of sinks into your head a little bit. First obvious question, what's the difference between a bolt and a screw, or a screw and a bolt? And to be honest, like a lot of my answers for this sheet are going to be kind of my opinion or my sort of experience with it, and it may or may not be 100% accurate. As a general rule, from my experience, people call big stuff bolts. So stuff that's really big is a bolt, whereas things that are smaller, here I have a collection, these are screws because they're just smaller. Well, then I went online and I looked it up, and technically there is a different definition floating around. This is a bearing off my car. I had to replace it. This is on the back wheel of the bearing. This is where the wheel bolts on. And technically, these are called screws because they have only one attachment. They're connected here, and you just put this nut on. That's what holds the wheel onto the car. So these technically are screws, where I would call them bolts because they're so darn big. This whole bearing assembly is all worn out inside. The bearing was making noise when you're driving, so I had to put a new one on. But at the back, it's bolted to the car itself through the axle with these 4. And because there's no thread, there was actually a bolt with a nut on the other end, like this. It was on the car with 4 of those. Not this, I just put this in to show, but it's not the right one. Technically, from what I read on the internet, that's a bolt because it has the bolt threaded part and it has a nut on the end. So if you have something like that, that's considered a bolt. But if you just use the one part, it's considered a screw. I'm not sure I buy that argument, but that's what I read. So most times people look at bigger stuff as bolts and smaller stuff as screws. They even will go so far as to call these kinds of screws machine screws. Basically because, let me use a bigger one, the thread is the same all the way along. It's the same size, same diameter. It gets kind of messy when you talk about different types of screws, because then you get what a lot of people call wood screws. These are those kinds of screws that are tapered. They have a very aggressive spiral on them, a very aggressive thread, but they always taper on the end. And they do that because it's very easy to go into wood. I already made the hole here, and I have the screwdriver somewhere. So a wood screw is not the same as a metal screw or a machine screw. Anytime you see one of these kinds of screws, it's typically meant to go into some soft material, wood, maybe a plastic, maybe something like drywall or something like that. But this idea that it has this sort of very aggressive spiral with a taper and a tip point means you kind of like jab it into something and you start turning and it will bite itself in and turn in. So those are the kinds of screws, and people use the terms kind of loosely. A bolt, a screw or a machine screw, and then what might be called a wood screw, or just a soft material screw. Okay, so I kind of touched on it. What's the difference? But what's the type of bolts? A lot of the times the type of bolt can vary. You might have a bolt that has what's called a shank, or no threads here, it's just the smooth part, because you only need a bit of thread on the end. You might have one with threads all the way. You might have ones with different types of heads on the end, and I'm going to come to that as well. You might have some that have a certain taper for a different reason on them. A different style again. There's so many types of bolts, it's hard to say. A lot of people call these hex bolts because the head is very familiar. It has a hex shape on it. When you put the wrench on it, you can see that. Crazy as it seems, these are often called Allen key bolts because it has this sort of six-sided hex shape, but they don't call these hex ones. They're called Allen bolts because they were used by, if I can find them, sorry, I should have had that ready. You use this thing here and it goes in here. Oh, I got the wrong size, but you get the idea. And this is called an Allen key, and I'm guessing it was invented by a guy named Allen. That's why they call it an Allen key. So there's a different kind again. If you ever used a socket set, if you look closely at them, this is called a 6-point socket or a hex socket because it fits in just properly like a hex. If you can see that, if you get the light right. Okay, now there's another kind of socket, and these are called 12-point. It's kind of like a double hex if you can see inside. It's still a hex, but these are different kinds of sockets for different uses or different reasons, but depending on the kind of bolt or screw that you have. I think I've already talked about the different types of screws. What materials or properties are used to make screws and bolts? If you look on the end of a screw, typically, or a bolt, you can sometimes see on a hex one, for example, these little notches. And I'll see if you can see it in the video. There's a notch here, a notch here, a notch here. That's an indication of the type of strength this bolt is designed to do. This is average. It has 3 notches, so this bolt is probably pretty good steel. It's not the best steel. If you had some maybe holding on the wheel of your car, I don't see the notches on these ones, but those ones are going to be very tough, very strong steel because you need them to be a very strong kind of bolt. If you're one of those people who buys cheap stuff at a dollar store, if you see screws, they might have 1 notch. They're made with a very cheap, soft metal. My advice, don't buy bolts and screws at a dollar store. They're junk. I wouldn't get them. Sometimes you get screws that are made of different material. I don't know if you can tell, but this one's coated in something so it doesn't rust. So it has a certain kind of property. I have some screws somewhere, if I can find them, and they're made of brass. Brass is a soft gold-colored metal, and it won't rust. So there's a reason you would make something like that. On my motorcycle, on the back license plate, I have some small screws that are actually made of plastic because I put them there so they don't rust. Then if I have to take the license plate off or something, the plastic screws just come out. They're not very strong, but they do the job. So depending on what you're using your nuts and bolts for, they will be made out of different kinds of material. If you don't want them to rust, you'll make them out of something non-ferrous, something with no iron in them. If you need them to be very strong, like something you're holding your car together, then the metal itself will be a very tough, very strong kind of material for those. And of course there's a whole variety in between. What style of heads? I've already touched on the idea that you have a hex head or an Allen key head. But when you're using screws, sometimes you get a variety of them. This is a very common head, and it's really just one that you use a flat screwdriver on. It's very common in different parts of the world, but it's disappearing in North America. People don't like this head because it doesn't work very well. It's kind of old now. It works, but often you slip, and when you really have to tighten it, this slot can get damaged or the screwdriver doesn't stick in it. What you see in Canada more often are these kinds of screws. They have a square head hole in them, no slot. And you get this kind of a head set up. This screwdriver has a little square notch in it. It fits perfectly in there. It's called a Robertson screwdriver. And, believe it or not, Robertson was a Canadian. These screws, these Robertson screws, is a Canadian invention. It's a very popular screw because it fits in, and boy, can you ever tighten it if you need to. So you'll often see different screws with a Robertson head in it. There it is there. And this screw is more of a North American screw because it has the Robertson and it has the flat slot in it, so you can use either of both. The different Robertsons come in different sizes, so if you look, I can show this in the video, you'll see different size squares for different size screws. So the very small one is a Robertson number 0, then the next one is a Robertson number 1, the one you see everywhere for some reason is number 2. It's very popular. Most of the screws you'll see around are number 2s. Number 3s are for bigger ones. Honestly, I don't know if I've ever seen a number 4, if it even exists. Another famous screw type, if I can find the one I had somewhere, somehow, you've all seen them, I'm sure. If I want one, I can't find one. Oh, here it is. That's another style. It's often, some people call it a star. And surprisingly enough, you'll see this style of a screwdriver, and it was invented by Mr. Phillips. So some people, if you're ever working, will say, oh, get me a Phillips screwdriver. What they're really saying is they want that star one. Get me a Phillips screwdriver. And like the Robertson, it comes in different sizes. I'm not as familiar. This is a number 1, this is a number 3. There's different types out there for sure. Those are the more common ones, Robertson, the flat, the Phillips. There are other ones out there. There's different kinds you'll see. If you've ever looked carefully at stuff in the public washrooms, like the soap dispenser or the hand dryer or something, they have special heads on them that don't fit any of the normal traditional tools. So you have to have a very special wrench or tool to get it on or off, because they want to do that to prevent people from stealing stuff. If you don't have that special tool, you can't undo it and take it away. Types of wrenches, sockets, or drivers, I've kind of already touched on that, so I'm answering that question. What types of nuts are there? It sounds kind of silly to talk about it, but this part that goes on the thread, this is called the nut. And most nuts are just a hex nut. It's just a general kind of hex nut. But there can be other kinds. This is the nut that goes onto the car, if you can see it, and that goes on to hold the wheel on. It's a special kind of nut that you would have. I have another one here. I found it's made of brass. I don't know why I have it, but it's a hex nut, but this is a material that won't rust. It's a soft metal, but it would be useful for some reasons. This nut, I'm not really sure what it's called, but it kind of has this washer on the end. We talked about the nut, but often you'll see this round piece, and call it a washer. It goes on, and this nut actually has, oh, that's not the right one. This actually has a sort of a built-in washer on it, so there's a different kind of nut there. A last kind is called the nylock nut, and it looks like a regular nut. It's a hex shape, but on the other side you'll see it has this nylon in there. I don't know if the camera's going to zoom in here. Boy, are my hands dirty. You can see this bit of a nylon in there, and when you put that onto a screw, if that fits in here, when you screw this in, what happens, that screw's not working. What will happen is the nylon helps protect the thread. It will come through, and then when you force the thread through the nylon pinches down on the thread and stops the nut from undoing itself. It can't undo it. So that's a special kind of nut for certain situations. Okay. Washers. I kind of touched on that idea already. When you have a bolt and you're putting a washer on it, there's different types of washers. So the first kind of washer is put on usually to spread the load out. I'll use this one as an example. There is a washer on here. When you tighten this on and push against the wheel to squish the wheel on, this washer kind of spreads the load out, or the force out, and spreads it around so it's not concentrated in one location. It sort of helps the whole wheel on. Whenever you're putting a bolt on something, you'll put this on, and then you put the washer on, and then when you tighten the nut, if you push against it, because the washer is a bigger diameter, it spreads the force out across whatever you're pinching with the nut. So that's the purpose of washers. Again, I've got a gazillion washers here. Some are made of brass for some reason, so they don't rust. I probably got that off of a toilet or something sometime. I can't remember. Different diameters for different reasons to spread the load out when you're putting something on. A common problem with nuts and bolts and stuff is they come loose. You tighten them down, you think it's tight, and then something is pushing on them, torquing on them, vibrating them or something, and they come loose. So that's why people invented this. This is a special washer. It's called a lock washer. And it's made of a special steel that's very springy, very tough, but it's a springy washer. And the idea is, when you put the washer on, you put a lock washer, and then when you tighten, as you squish it, now I can't do it by hand, but as you squish it, that pinched part, that springy part, gets squished flat, and that pushes back on the washer and the nut. It puts a lot of sort of sideways back and forth tension on the threads inside. It's pushing, and it kind of helps to jam it there against the threads so it can't vibrate loose. So the idea of the lock washer is to put more tension on the threads and hopefully prevent the nut from coming loose. So you're often putting stuff together, maybe some furniture or something on your car, and you'll see a lock washer put in. That's what that job is. Some jobs, some jobs you don't have vibration or a chance of it coming loose, so you wouldn't put a lock washer and you just put a regular washer. If you don't really care if the load's spread out, you may not put a washer on it. Okay? So that covers that. What other type of fasteners are there? There's so many different kinds out there, but they often come back to having that same kind of a thread. Is this a special fastener? You can picture what would happen if I needed something like this. I don't know why I have it, but it's just really a threaded bolt, and then someone bent it into that, so you could bolt it somewhere and hang something on that, a hook or something. Because it's round, I've heard them call eye bolts, because it has a round eye bolt. Well, if you have a muffler on your car, you'll have something like that typically holding something. It's called a U-bolt because it has the letter U. Probably they made the thread here and here on a straight piece, and then they just bent it into a U shape. And then you can put some washers or nuts on it. It's a special kind of fastener. Probably some of you have this kind of a fastener in your house. I guess this is really just a nut on it with a basic screw. The idea is this spring-loaded thing goes like this. So you would drill a hole, let's say in the wall or something, and you stick this. Do it this way. You stick this thing into the hole, and then it pops out on the back side. And then when you tighten it, it pulls against it. So you could hang up a heavy picture on the drywall or on the wall somehow, because in the back, this thing is holding it. So it's a special kind of fastener. I had this. I brought my boat home, and the car trailer, where you hook the trailer up, this goes into the back of the car on the trailer hitch. And what holds it in? Well, it's really just a pin. But what stops the pin from falling out when you're driving on the highway? It has one of these clip pins. It's a fastener, just goes through the hole. It's made of a special springy steel so that it just springs in there. And when you want to, you pull it out. You see how it just springs over that pin. You pull this out, and the idea with these is that if it gets dirty or rusty or something from driving on the road in the rain, in the mud or whatever, you don't have a thread here that will get all rusty and you have to undo the nut, and you just have some easy clip system, fastener system that's easy to undo. And that's the idea behind that one. Here's another example. This is the trailer ball. Very important when I'm driving on the highway that this bolt doesn't come loose. Okay? Now technically, because it bolts into this, should I call this a screw or should I call it a bolt? And is this a nut or is this a part for the trailer hitch or something? It's a gray area. What's exactly going on? It's hard to say. Some people call them bolts, some people call them nuts, screws. I'm just saying what I know so you get a general sense of what's out there. Last thing I'm going to leave with you. All of the screws that I've shown you, typically 99% of all the screws are called right-hand threads, because when you turn them, you turn to the right. Right-hand threads. Believe it or not, there are situations where you have a left-hand thread. I'm turning to the right to put the nut on. But there are situations where you actually would have the spiral going the other way. If you can, I don't know if I can do this in the video. It spirals this way, spirals to the right as it goes in. But there are bolts that spiral this way, or sorry, not just bolts, but screws or threads that spiral this way. Let me give you an example where I would want that. Let's just pretend this was being held on my car. And there's a big nut somewhere in the middle, and I'm driving down the highway and the wheel is turning this way. I turn the nut in, put it in this way to tighten it on. Then I'm driving down the road and the wheel's turning this way. What might it do to the nut? I tighten it on this way. I'm tightening it on this way. But the wheel will turn this way when I go down the highway. Then the nut could actually undo itself. It would spin loose, fall off, and then your wheel could fall off. So it's not uncommon in some situations when you have something that's tightened on with a nut, say a certain way, if it can turn against the thread and loosen itself and fall off, the people, the engineers, the designers, people like you and me, will say, hey, that's not good. For this situation, we better make the thread go the other way. So you tighten it this way, if that makes sense. Tighten it this way. And if the wheel's turning and it's going to loosen the nut, in fact, the opposite will happen. It will actually tighten the nut and it won't fall off. Easiest example, on my bicycle I have the two pedals. One has a right-hand thread and one has the left-hand thread. And right now I can't remember which one it was, but you have to be careful. If when I was taking it off, I didn't think of that, and I've got the wrench on and I'm pushing and pushing and pushing, like, why won't this thing come off? Then I like, oh yeah, left hand, right hand. One side, if you didn't change the direction of the thread, when you're pedaling, the pedal might just fall off while you're going down the road, and that's the reason. If you think about other applications in your world, I think you can start thinking there are other places where you need a left-hand thread. 99% of the world, they're right-hand threads. Don't know why, but that's what it is. But there are places where you have to spin it the other way. Yes, it's real. So I hope that helps understand nuts, bolts, screws, washers, and the different kinds and different types. And just generally touching on it, there's a gazillion more examples out there as well. Hope that helps. Yes, you know an assignment's coming.